Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, one of the really huge challenges of our time, planning our global energy future. The transition to renewable energy isn't just about, say, building solar panels or wind turbines. It's really about accurately modeling the entire system. That way, we can ensure a reliable supply and, frankly, avoid some catastrophic, really costly mistakes. And this task, it's overwhelmingly complex. That's exactly why we're diving deep into a pretty groundbreaking study today. It's titled Hierarchical Approach to Energy System Modeling, Complexity Reduction with Minor Changes in Results.
Yeah, it's really vital work. This study comes from Dmitry Bogdanov, Ayobami Solomon Oyewo, and Christian Breyer at LUT University. And it essentially promises a kind of shortcut, you could say, to getting smarter, faster insights into how our energy future might look.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack this novel methodology. The big promise is making this super complex energy system modeling much more efficient, right? But without sacrificing accuracy.
Exactly. Because the sheer ambition of transitioning to a defossilized energy system, one completely free of fossil fuels, it demands incredibly accurate long-term planning. And to do that, energy models need to operate with just incredible detail.
What kind of detail are we talking about?
Think about it. High temporal resolution. That means hourly, sometimes even sub-hourly data. It's essential to properly capture the variability, the ups and downs of renewable sources like wind and solar, and also the precise needs for energy storage.
Ah, okay. So it's not just knowing how much sun we might get in a whole day. It's got to be hour by hour, almost minute by minute. Otherwise, the whole grid could have problems.
That's the challenge. It's like forecasting the weather, but for the energy grid, second by second.
Wow. But it's not just about time, is it? You mentioned spatial resolution, too. How does that add to the complexity?
Precisely. We need high spatial resolution. That means a multinodal approach, looking at different regions specifically. Without it, you run into this thing called the copper plate effect.
A copper plane effect.
Yeah, it's where models kind of assume electricity flows perfectly and instantly between regions, like over a solid sheet of copper. It completely ignores real-world grid limitations and, crucially, the costs. If you just average large regions together, you can seriously underestimate how variable renewables really are and, the actual costs of building and upgrading the grid.
Okay, so time and space. And then I guess you have to throw in all the different ways we use energy, not just electricity.
That's where it gets even more complex. Integrating power, heat, transport, and industrial sectors, what we call sector coupling, along with all the emerging technologies.
Oh.
Things like CDR, carbon dioxide removal, or desalination. It just adds layers and layers.
So how complex do these models actually get?
Well, the result is that modern energy system models, like the LUT Energy System Transition Model, or LUT-ESTM, which they used in this study, they can easily end up with tens of millions of variables and constraints.
Tens of millions.
Yeah. And that, as you can imagine, demands just vast computational resources, huge amounts of computer power, and, importantly, time to actually run the optimizations.
So if these models are that complex, needing so much power, what are the real-world stakes if we can't model accurately or quickly enough? Is it just, slower research, or is it more serious?
Oh, it's far more critical than just research deadlines. This need for incredible detail to really capture renewable energy variability and how everything's interconnected, it directly creates this huge computational bottleneck. And if you think about the bigger picture, it means decision makers, policymakers, investors. They're often forced into this really tough choice between speed and accuracy.
That sounds like a terrible trade-off.
It is, especially when you're talking about billions, potentially trillions of dollars or euros in infrastructure investments, not to mention our energy security. And the traditional ways of simplifying things, like time series aggregation or reducing spatial resolution, they often lead to significant deviations, big errors in the results, especially when you have high shares of renewables in the system.
So it's like we're stuck. We need the detail for good decisions, but the detail makes the process incredibly slow and cumbersome.
That's the core problem.
Okay, so this is the gap, the challenge that this study, Hierarchical Approach to Energy System Modeling, is really trying to tackle. They're looking for that sweet spot, speed, and accuracy.
Exactly.
So let's get into it. How does this hierarchical approach actually work? What's the magic here?
Well, what's really clever about this methodology, its core idea, is that it combines simulations run at different levels of detail, some at lower spatial resolution, some at higher. The basic idea is to break down one single massive optimization problem into multiple, smaller, much more manageable optimization tasks. It's essentially, as you said before, a kind of structured divide and conquer strategy, but for energy planning.
Right, divide and conquer. So instead of one giant messy puzzle, you solve several smaller connected ones. Okay, let's walk through the steps. They use Japan as a case study, right? How'd it work there?
Yeah, the Japan case study illustrates it really well. There are basically four main steps. Okay, step one.
Step one is full resolution definition. This is where you define the ultimate level of detail you actually want to achieve in the end. For Japan, the researchers collected data for all 47 prefectures. But they initially structured the input data for 9 larger subregions. These correspond to the main electric power companies, the EPCOs, Hokkaido, Tohoku, Tokyo, and so on. So this sets the gold standard level of detail for the whole system they're aiming for.
Got it. Establish the target detail first. Then what?
Then step 2, aggregation to macro regions and simulation. Now here, they intentionally decrease the spatial resolution to cut down complexity, right? For Japan, those 9 EPCO subregions were grouped, or aggregated, into just 3 larger macro regions, Northeast, Center, and Southwest.
Was that grouping just random?
No, not at all. It was based on logical factors like existing grid frequency differences between areas, and also similarities in resource conditions like wind or solar potential. Then, an energy system transition simulation is run, but only for these 3 larger macro regions.
Okay, so a simplified run first. What does that give you? The really critical output from this step is the overall transition pathway for the country. But crucially, it also calculates the optimal power flows between these macro regions. Now, you have to accept that the results at this aggregated level will have some inaccuracies. Like, it probably underestimates the variability of renewables within those big regions. But it gives you the essential high-level picture of energy exchange.
Okay, so you trade some local detail for a faster overview, but you capture those big interregional energy flows. That sounds key. What's step 3?
Step 3 is separate macro region solutions. Now, you take each of those 3 macro regions, Northeast, Center, Southwest, and you model each one individually. But here's the clever part. You model them in full regional resolution. So, for example, the Northeast macro region is modeled with its original internal subregion, say Hokkaido and Tohoku.
I see. So you zoom back in, but only one macro region at a time.
Exactly. You treat each one like an energy island for the simulation, but with its internal details restored. And crucially, those power flows between the macro regions, the ones we calculated back in step 2, they are incorporated directly into the energy balance equations for the sub-regions that sit on the borders.
Okay, so each macro region solves its internal puzzle, but it knows how much energy it needs to trade with its neighbors based on the step 2 results.
Precisely. It ensures the overall country-level energy exchange derived from the simpler model is still accounted for when you do the detailed modeling within each macro region. And if there are multiple grid connections between macro regions, they have rules for splitting those flows, maybe based on existing line capacity or sometimes just equally.
Makes sense. So you've got the detailed internal solutions for each macro region, respecting the broader flows. What's the final step? Step 4.
Step 4 is full resolution results. This is where you basically stitch it all back together.
Yeah.
The results from the individual macro region simulations from step 3 are merged or combined to represent the fully integrated energy system of the entire country. So, back to the full 9 subregions for Japan in this case. The detailed system structure, how it operates, the grid infrastructure within each macro region, that comes directly from the detailed step 3 simulations. But the power flows between the macro regions, those are still based on the initial aggregated simulation in step 2.
So that's actually quite elegant. You get the broad strokes quickly, then fill in the details region by region, making sure the connections match up. And you mentioned this is scalable.
That's another powerful aspect. This hierarchical idea isn't just limited to 2 levels like this. The study suggests you could apply it to even more levels. They mention, for example, a potential 5-level approach for Japan, maybe starting from Northeast Asia down to Japan as a whole, then the 3 macro regions, then the 9 subregions, and finally the 47 prefectures. Or you could even imagine modeling the entire world this way, breaking it down into potentially thousands of regions.
Wow. That really opens things up for tackling huge interconnected problems. But it brings me back to something you mentioned earlier, dealing with renewables. How do you handle aggregating things like solar and wind profiles without falling into that copper plate trap you described? Doesn't averaging smooth things out too much?
That's an excellent point, and it's a critical part of the methodology they had to address. Aggregating variable renewable energy, or VRE, profiles for those larger macro regions in step 2 can definitely lead to inaccuracies. You might overestimate the potential if the profile is dominated by one really good spot far away, Or you might underestimate it if good local potential gets averaged down. And, as you said, the biggest risk is smoothing out that crucial hour-to-hour variability, which then makes you underestimate how much storage you really need. That's a major pitfall.
So how did this study get around that? What were their specific methods to make sure the VRE aggregation was, good enough?
They explored a couple of specific strategies for calculating those macro-region RE profiles in Step 2. One way was to calculate them as the simple average of the profiles from the underlying subregions. Another was using a weighted average, maybe based on the potential or demand in each subregion. Interestingly, for their Japan case study, a key finding from a methodological standpoint was that the simple average, just giving equal weight to each subregion's profile, was actually sufficient. It gave results very similar to the more complex weighted average.
Oh, that's useful. A simpler method working well makes it more practical.
Definitely. And they tested this robustness by running 3 distinct scenarios, specifically looking at how the RE profiles were calculated.
What were those scenarios?
Okay, first was 9 reg. That's the baseline, the standard simulation run at the full 9 subregion resolution, no hierarchy involved. Second was 3 MCA. This used the hierarchical approach, and the A stands for average. So the macro-region RE profiles in Step 2 were calculated as the simple average of the underlying regional profiles. And third was 3 MCNT. Also hierarchical, but here the seat means the macro-region profiles were calculated based on resource data for the entire macro-region treated as a single unit, the standard way you might do it if you weren't thinking hierarchically.
Okay, 3 ways to handle the RE profiles within the hierarchical structure compared to the full detail run. What was the benefit of using 3 MCA or 3 MCS?
The main benefit they found was that both hierarchical approaches significantly reduced that copper plate effect we talked about. They helped avoid getting unrealistically high estimates for how much energy you get out of wind or solar technologies, those full load hours or FLH. This is particularly important when you aggregate over large areas with diverse resource quality.
Right, so the big question then, did this methodological cleverness, this hierarchical trick, actually pay off in practice? Did it deliver on that promise of speed and accuracy?
It absolutely did. The results reported in the study are really quite striking. In terms of speed, the hierarchical approach delivered a computational time reduction by a factor of 2.3 to 3.3 compared to running the full 9 subregion simulation, 9 reg.
Wow, 2 to 3 times faster. Can you give us the actual numbers?
Sure. The full 9 reg simulation took roughly 671,823 seconds to run. That's quite a long time, nearly 8 days. In contrast, the hierarchical 3 MCA scenario took about 204,568 seconds under 2.5 days. And 3 MCA took around 285,015 seconds, about 3.3 days. So massive time saving.
That is a huge strategic difference.
Yeah.
Being able to run simulations in, say, 2 or 3 days instead of 8, that completely changes how researchers and planners can work. You could run 3 times as many what-if scenarios, couldn't you?
Exactly. It allows for much more exploration, testing different assumptions, different policies.
Okay, but the crucial part, accuracy. Did speeding it up compromise the results? How close were the hierarchical runs to the gold standard 9 reg simulation?
That's the most impressive part. Crucially, no, it didn't significantly compromise accuracy. The study found that the key outputs, things like installed capacities of different technologies and overall system costs throughout the entire transition period they modeled, 2020 to 2050, stayed within a remarkably tight range, plus or minus 3% of the full resolution simulation results. And if you look specifically at the target year, 2050, the costs were even closer, within due to 2.5%.
Within 3%, that's incredibly close, especially given the massive speed up. Did all the approaches still show the same overall energy transition pathway for Japan?
Yes, fundamentally. All the modeling approaches the standard 9 reg, and both hierarchical versions 3 MCA and 3 MEXIROC show Japan successfully transitioning from its current fossil-based system to a 100% renewable energy system by 2050. And they followed a very, very similar path to get there.
That's fantastic consistency. Were there any more subtle differences, maybe in the exact mix of technologies or how the system operated?
There were some small nuanced changes, yes. The hierarchical simulations, 3 MCA and 3 N3 terrain, tended to result in slightly higher total power generation capacity, up to maybe 1.2% higher. This was mostly due to a slight increase in wind power capacity. They also noticed a tendency for a bit more power generation happening in the northeastern subregions like Hokkaido and Tohoku, which have really good wind potential. As a result, there was a bit more electricity flowing from north to south across Japan in those hierarchical runs.
Okay, slight shifts in where generation happens. Did that affect other parts of the system? Storage, for example?
Yeah, consequently, there was a slightly decreased role for energy storage compared to the 9-reg run, and a corresponding slight increase in electricity curtailment, meaning times when you have to deliberately reduce renewable output because there's too much power, especially in that windy northeast. Interestingly, the heat system wasn't really affected directly. Any changes were just indirect consequences of the shifts in electricity generation.
Fascinating. And what about the comparison between the two ways they handled the RE profiles in the hierarchy, 3MCA versus 3MSET? Did one match the full simulation better?
Good question. The 3MCA scenario, remember, that's the one using the average of regional profiles for the macro regions, actually yielded results that were slightly closer to the standard 9-reg simulation. They were within about 1% in the final year, 2050. The 3MCA scenario, using profiles calculated for the whole macro region, had slightly larger deviations, but remember, it offered faster simulation times than 3MCA. So the conclusion was that both hierarchical approaches were perfectly applicable, at least for the Japan case. It shows the core methodology is robust, even with slightly different ways of handling the RE profiles.
So you have a choice. Slightly more accuracy with 3MCA or slightly faster speed with 3MCA, but both are vastly faster and still very accurate compared to the full run.
Precisely. And like you said before, when speed is so important for exploring scenarios, and accuracy is critical because we're talking about avoiding potentially stranded multi-billion-dollar assets.
Yeah.
Well, getting a 2- to 3-fold reduction in computation time while keeping results this close, that's an absolute game changer for researchers and policymakers. It just lets you explore so many more options, more what-ifs.
That flexibility seems incredibly valuable for navigating something as complex as the energy transition. So just to sum up the advantages. Beyond the speed and accuracy, what are the key benefits this hierarchical methodology brings to the table?
Well, fundamentally, it enables the simulation of much more complex energy system models than were maybe feasible before. You could potentially add more technologies, a couple more sectors, maybe even push for higher spatial or temporal resolution in the detailed steps, step 3, because the overall burden is reduced. As we've discussed, it really facilitates studying multiple scenarios, doing sensitivity analyses much more rapidly. This lets researchers adapt quickly if assumptions change or if new policy targets come up. And there's a practical benefit, maybe more for the researchers themselves, increased robustness. If your computer crashes or there's a software glitch during a long run.
Oh yeah, the nightmare scenario.
Exactly. With the hierarchical approach, you only lose the progress on the current step, because the results from the previous steps, like the macro region flows from step 2, are already saved. It limits the potential time loss.
That's a really practical plus. Okay, but no method is perfect. Where did the study identify weaknesses or limitations? What are the catches or things to watch out for when using this approach?
Right. Understanding the limitations is just as important as knowing the benefits. It's not a magic bullet. The main source of the small deviations they did find, it primarily comes down to the underestimation of transmission grid costs within the macro regions during that aggregated simulation in step 2. Because you're simplifying in step 2, you might slightly overestimate how easily power can flow within those large macro regions, potentially giving a false sense of free access to the best renewable energy spots, like that great wind potential up in Hokkaido, without fully accounting for the grid needed to get it there internally.
Ah, okay. So that means how you define those macro regions in the first place becomes really critical, doesn't it? You can't just draw arbitrary boxes on a map.
Absolutely crucial. The study really emphasizes this. You need to define those macro regions carefully. Ideally, you should consider the existing high-capacity grid structure group regions together that are already well connected. Also, the subregions within a macro region should preferably be contiguous, geographically touching. And you want to minimize the distance between the main demand centers within that macro region. Why? To minimize those underestimated internal grid costs we just talked about. And another point, try to avoid combining island subregions into a mainland macro region if you can help it, because the costs of undersea cables are different and might get averaged out incorrectly. They noted Japan's geography made this tricky, and it led to some minor underestimation of import-export costs in their case.
So it's a powerful method, but applying it requires smart choices based on the actual geography and grid you're modeling.
Precisely. It's a very effective tool, but you need to apply it thoughtfully with that clear understanding of the specific regional context. They also noted something interesting about Japan specifically. Its relatively limited overall renewable energy potential compared to its high energy demand actually helped to restrict the deviations in their study. Solar PV, for instance, is the lowest cost option, and it got utilized almost fully in all scenarios, hierarchical or not. Regions with perhaps more abundant and flexible renewable potential might see slightly larger deviations when using the hierarchical approach because there are more trade-offs for the model to make.
That makes sense. Any other limitations mentioned?
One other methodological point they acknowledged was how the algorithm currently handles situations where there are multiple grid connections between two macro regions. It splits the power flows and the transmission capacity investment equally between those connections. That might not perfectly reflect how the grid would optimally route power in reality. Future work could refine that.
Okay, good to know the caveats. So let's bring this all together, our deep dive into this study. Hierarchical approach to energy system modeling. Complexity reduction with minor changes in results really shows a significant step forward in how we can tackle these huge energy planning
It
problems.
truly does. The key takeaway is that this hierarchical simulation approach demonstrably cuts down model size and optimization time massively by factors of 2.3 to 3.3 in their case study. And it does this while keeping the crucial simulation results like the system structure, the technology mix, the overall energy costs remarkably close within that 2.5 to 3% band compared to running the full, complex, high-resolution simulation.
So, for you, our listener, what this really means is that we now have a tool that allows us to explore these critical energy transition pathways with, frankly, unprecedented speed and detail combined. It unlocks the ability to study many more scenarios, to incorporate more complex interactions between sectors and technologies, and ultimately to gain deeper, more reliable insights into how we actually build a sustainable energy future. And maybe stepping back even further. As we face more and more complex global challenges, not just climate change, but resource management, maybe even pandemics, this study offers a really compelling blueprint, a way to break down overwhelming, interconnected problems into more manageable parts, solve them, and then intelligently put the pieces back together. So here's a final thought to leave you with. How might applying this kind of multi-level hierarchical thinking, breaking down complexity while maintaining connections, how might that apply to challenges in your field or other complex global issues? Could it unlock insights that seemed too complex to grasp before? That's all for this deep dive. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.